Morning, Eben. Thanks for having me.
Imraan, just tell us, what do you see as the extent of tolerance on the South African political landscape?
Well, Eben, I think political tolerance has been on the decline in South Africa for a number of years now. And I think when we talk about political intolerance, we're talking about it at the party political level. I think we're also talking about intolerance within the alliance. And I think particularly important, intolerance growing on the part of the state and the ruling party towards poor people's movements and social movements. I think in the last few years, in the last sort of 10 years, I think, we've had at least 25 people being victims of police brutality. And that's besides Marikana. And I think following from your report a short while ago, we've had 2 people killed in Brits yesterday, again victims of police brutality. So there certainly is political intolerance growing at multiple levels.
Do we have a historical problem with political intolerance where under apartheid, every dissenting voice was put down? Or is there something brand new that's developing under the new dispensation?
Well, listen, we certainly had political intolerance during apartheid. But let's be clear about this, that was a completely different context. I think now the context we have in a post-apartheid situation is that political power is also linked to access to the public purse. It's linked to issues of social mobility, upward social mobility, issues of patronage, etc. And also I think the ruling party, having been a liberation movement and now the government of the day, like many liberation movements all over the world, obviously has had its own levels of authoritarianism within its own ranks. I think coming from being a liberation movement means that you haven't had heightened levels of internal democracy historically. So even though we enjoy great levels of democracy now and democratic institutions work, etc., and for all of this we need to credit the ruling party. We also need to remember that the fact that the ruling party was a liberation movement and the fact that it hasn't historically enjoyed heightened levels of internal democracy to some extent also spills over into a post-democratic context.
What do you make of the recent cases involving the EFF at Nkandla and then the DA before that? What do you make of it?
Well, clearly it was indicative of the levels of political intolerance in our country. I think what we remember more clearly now is not the DA incident, but the incident of Julius Malema just a few days ago. One is, I think, that attempt by Julius Malema was opportunistic. It was provocative, strategic maybe. But despite all of that, clearly he has the right to campaign in areas that are perceived to be the strongholds of particular parties. And I think the fact that people are prevented from campaigning and voicing their political voice in these areas needs to be condemned. I think what's pleasing from this particular incident is that the ANC has reacted strongly and I think is committed to disciplining members found guilty for preventing Malema and whoever else from taking part in their own political campaigns.
Now, Imraan, with the coming election in a couple of months' time, do you see the political temperature rising, and do you see this kind of opportunism on the rise and then political intolerance also rising because of that?
No, absolutely. I think political intolerance will rise. I think this election is perhaps the most difficult for the African National Congress since '94. I think there are a whole range of concerns about its own governance. I think the ANC is concerned about falling below a kind of 60% psychological barrier. I think we've had the emergence of a number of new political parties. We have the EFF making a strong stance and almost, contesting the terrain of the ANC in some ways. And I think bearing in mind that we're in 20 years of democracy, it's an election year, and with all the factors around growing political parties, I think we are likely to see intolerance grow as we run up to the elections.
Is this a real threat? Do we see an escalation in violence? And is this an indicator of political immaturity within our country?
I think we've seen an escalation of violence even, but I think we can't talk about this escalation in violence in the same way across the provinces. I think they've manifested in different ways. I think in Durban particularly we've seen perhaps a heightened level of political intolerance, particularly towards social movements. I think there's a vast amount of writing around how social movements have been victims of police brutality. And I don't necessarily think it's political immaturity. In part it might be, but it's also about people not wanting to subscribe to the principles that they are meant to subscribe to in terms of accommodating various political views. And I think what's particularly important also is the fact that political power is so closely linked to the public purse. So people, would do whatever they can in order to get political power, in order to access the public purse, and in order in that way to also gain some level of upward social mobility.
I wanted to ask you about a few of the other instances that were notable in the last year or so. What did you make of the throwing of human feces outside the provincial legislature in Cape Town and at the airport?
Well, listen, the Democratic Alliance has made a number of tactical and ethical miscalculations, especially in the Western Cape. And I think that was a dramatic form of protest, but it wasn't necessarily violent. And I think people in the Western Cape have been driven to a level where they wanted to ensure that particularly middle-class people in South Africa are able to appreciate, are able to understand the kind of inhumane conditions under which poor people live in the Western Cape. And I think the kind of ethical and moral miscalculations that the Democratic Alliance has made in the Western Cape has in many ways resulted in that. I think it needs to be condemned. It really is dramatic. But it also needs to be understood within a particular context. People are desperate in order to want to make their voices heard. I think, even the problem we have in South Africa is that we do have mechanisms for participation, formal mechanisms of participation. Constitutionally, legislatively, and even in terms of policy, the state has made provision for people to participate politically. The problem with all of these spaces is that they haven't really been meaningful, that people haven't seen meaningful results coming out of participation. What then happens is that people resort to dramatic forms of participation. People resort to what we've seen in the Western Cape, because the reality is that when you resort to violent and dramatic forms of participation, unfortunately that seems to be the only time that you are heard.
Yeah.
It's not when you go to local government meetings or sign petitions, one is not often heard as well as one is heard when one really embraces really dramatic forms of participation.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. That is a wonderful insight into political intolerance in South Africa. Very much a buzzword at the moment. And Imraan Buccus, who's the academic director from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, has written extensively on political intolerance in this country.